I'm Matthew Carter, 36 years old, and I'll never forget the look on my father's face the day he realized the supplier he desperately needed was now owned by the son he had just forced out of the company. "You don't do anything except collect a paycheck," he'd said, like I was some intern playing dress-up in his world. What he didn't know was that while he was busy protecting the business he built, I was quietly building something of my own. That morning, I stood across from him, not as his son, not as his employee, but as the one man who could now decide whether his company lived or died. Before we go any deeper into this, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove yourself to someone who was supposed to believe in you. My father, Richard Carter, started Carter Industrial back in 1975 with a rusted pickup truck, a $5,000 loan, and more stubbornness than sense. By the time I was born in '88, the company had grown enough to provide a comfortable life, modest but steady. I spent my childhood around concrete floors, heavy machinery, and the sharp tang of metal in the air. While other kids were riding bikes, I was learning the difference between a drill press and a lathe. My mother, Evelyn, had once been a school teacher. She was gentle, thoughtful, and never quite fit into Dad's world of steel and sales. She did her best to make our house feel like more than just an extension of the company break room. My sister Rachel was 3 years younger than me. She was fiery from the start. When she was 16 and told Dad she wanted to be a nurse instead of joining the company, he didn't speak to her for nearly a month. I watched that happen and decided early on I'd take the path of least resistance. I was good with numbers, so I studied finance and operations at his old college. Every summer I came home and worked in different departments, shipping, procurement, assembly, even HR. Dad never said much, but every once in a while he'd give me a nod that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I was doing something right. But by the time I graduated, I could see what no one else dared say out loud. Carter Industrial was stuck, still making the same product lines they'd been selling since the late '80s, with outdated equipment and no digital infrastructure to speak of. The business was worth maybe $10 million on paper, but it could have been 3 times that if we'd just adapted. I had put together a full modernization plan in college spreadsheet after spreadsheet of what we could do differently. But when I brought it up during winter break over ham and mashed potatoes, Dad waved it off. "Books don't build businesses," he said, pouring his usual evening bourbon. "You want to fix something? Learn how to run a shop floor." Still, I joined the company full-time after graduation. I didn't ask for a title, and I didn't expect special treatment. But I wasn't prepared for what he did next. On my first day, he called a company-wide meeting. Everyone was there, some who had known me since I was in braces. He introduced me like a stranger. "This is Matthew," he said. "He'll be starting at the bottom like everybody else. The Carter name doesn't earn you anything here." The message was loud and clear. That was the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming. Not just a test, but a warning. And I had no idea how far he'd go to keep me in my place. My first official day at Carter Industrial ended with grease on my hands, sore feet, and silence over dinner. Dad had me packing inventory in the shipping bay by 7:15 that morning. No explanation, no instruction, just a clipboard and a nod from the floor supervisor. The others didn't say much, though a few gave me quiet looks, some pity, some waiting to see if I'd fold. For 6 months, I rotated through every department. I swept metal shavings from machine pits, logged invoices in accounts receivable, even wrote along on client deliveries. Every mistake I made, I owned. Every suggestion I had, I kept to myself. But I was watching, taking notes on everything that was broken and everything that could be better. It was around that time I met Grace. She'd been with the company longer than some of the machines we still used. Mid-level management sharp as a tack, no time for nonsense. We crossed paths in product development where she pulled me aside one afternoon while waiting for a maintenance tech. "Your father built this place with muscle and instinct," she said, flipping through a binder. "But we're behind and everybody knows it. You ask me, we've got 5 years before this place starts bleeding out." I nodded because I had already come to the same conclusion. Grace didn't treat me like the boss's kid. She treated me like someone who could listen. She pointed out the bottlenecks no one talked about, the outdated suppliers, the clients we were on the verge of losing. And when she realized I wasn't just nodding along, I was planning, she started introducing me to others who felt the same. Folks who wanted to fix things but didn't have the authority to make change. Around the same time, I was seeing Amanda more regularly. We'd met in college, she was in marketing, and even though she didn't work in the industry, she understood the weight of what I was trying to carry. Some nights when I'd come home late, she'd listen as I walked through a pricing model or outlined a new product pitch on our kitchen table. "He's scared," she said one evening after I'd told her about Dad shooting down my last proposal without reading past page 2. "Your ideas don't just challenge him, they threaten the way he's always done things." 6 months into my full-time role, I spotted our opening. One of our biggest accounts had started eyeing a competitor that offered newer, more customizable components. I stayed late every night that week building a proposal, a modest redesign of our product line, new materials, upgraded specs. I showed the pricing, the lead time, even broke down how we could retool without shutting down production. At the next management meeting, I slid a copy of the proposal across the table to Dad. He didn't even glance at it before saying, "We've made this part the same way for 20 years. It still sells." "It's not selling," I said before I could stop myself. "We're about to lose the account." The room went dead quiet. His jaw locked up, but before he could say a word, Noah, one of the older board members, spoke up. "Maybe we should at least hear the plan," he said, nodding in my direction. "The numbers look solid." Dad didn't argue, not then. He gave me 2 months and a small team. When it fails, he said we go back to my way. But it didn't fail. The client not only stayed, they increased their order. After that, I was promoted to department head. Quietly, of course. No speeches, no handshake, just a line in the memo and a key to a second-hand office upstairs. Over the next year, I kept my head down and kept working. I made changes where I could, small things at first. Better vendor contracts, shorter fulfillment cycles, new training programs. Every quarter, our numbers improved. Grace's department mirrored our updates. Other managers started stopping by with questions. The ripple effect was noticeable, and it made Dad uneasy. One afternoon, after a particularly efficient rollout, he called me into his office. "You're creating your own little empire in here," he said, arms folded. "This company survived for 30 years before you got here. Don't forget that." "I'm trying to help it survive 30 more," I said. But it was clear. He saw me as competition, not a partner. So I started looking deeper. If we were going to bring Carter Industrial into the modern era, I'd need more than spreadsheets and quiet allies. I'd need leverage. That's when I took a closer look at our supply chain and noticed how dependent we were on Bennett materials. They weren't flashy, but they were reliable. We used their alloys in nearly 60% of our products. I arranged a meeting with Martin Bennett under the pretense of renegotiating terms. We met for lunch at a quiet spot near his warehouse, and after some small talk, he leaned in and said, "I'm looking to retire Matthew, probably in the next year or 2. My kids don't want it. I'll sell to whoever comes with the right number." I asked him if Dad had ever tried to buy him out. He chuckled. 10 years ago. Your father said he didn't want to manage anyone else's mess. That night I told Amanda what I was thinking. If someone else buys Bennett, I said they could choke Carter Industrial from the inside out. "So why don't you buy it?" she asked, as casually as if she were suggesting we order takeout. At first it seemed impossible, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I built a plan, lined up financing, used everything I had: salary savings, my small inheritance, even some college contacts to secure a private loan. I created a holding company and moved quietly. No one at Carter Industrial suspected a thing. While I negotiated with Martin, I kept pushing forward at the company. We landed our first major account under the revised product line. Revenue was climbing, and the board started paying attention. Dad, of course, dismissed the changes as lucky timing. Anyone would have seen that opening, he said once in front of a group of clients. I didn't argue. I was playing a longer game. 5 years passed. Our valuation tripled. I was named Chief Operating Officer, though Dad still held the CEO title. I managed everything on the inside. He handled the handshakes. The company was becoming what I had always hoped for. But with every win, I could feel Dad tightening his grip. And then without warning, he brought in Samuel Foster, an old friend, called him a strategic advisor. I didn't buy it. Grace confirmed it weeks later. Samuel was being positioned as my replacement. They're building a case, she warned me. He wants you out, Matthew. I consulted Diana, our legal counsel. She didn't sugarcoat it. If he's got the votes, she said he can force you out. So I began preparing for the worst, documenting every success, every performance metric. And all the while, I continued working with Martin to finalize the Bennett deal. The company was on track to hit a $500 million valuation. But I could see it coming. Dad wasn't going to let me keep my seat at the table. And he had no idea I already owned the chair. The day Carter Industrial officially crossed the $500 million mark, we hosted a black tie celebration at the Grand Meridian downtown. Floor-to-ceiling banners, champagne fountains, a jazz quartet tucked near the ballroom doors. Everyone who mattered in our industry was there. My name was mentioned in every speech except Dad's. He stood center stage in a tailored tux, thanking partners and clients, shaking hands like the entire transformation had come from him alone. I didn't say much. I smiled, raised my glass when expected, and stepped out onto the terrace for air. That's when I heard it. Dad's voice, low but clear, coming from the smoking area just around the corner. Samuel was with him. "The board meeting is set for Monday," Samuel said. "We've got the votes. Maxwell won't know what hit him." Dad's reply didn't hesitate. "Make sure it's clean. I want him out by the end of the day." I stood there for a moment, letting the words settle. Then I turned and walked away. The notice came in my inbox the next morning, an emergency board meeting set for Monday. Agenda: urgent strategic matters. I called Noah. His silence on the other end said enough. "They've been working on this for months," he finally admitted. "Samuel's been meeting privately with 3 of the other board members. There's a file. Claims of reckless management, risky acquisitions, even questions about vendor relationships." I asked, "Do they really believe that no one's asked to see the full numbers?" he said. "And your father's never been short on persuasion." That weekend was quiet. Amanda kept Lily busy while I gathered documents and reviewed the last 5 years of operational records. I didn't sleep much. There wasn't time for bitterness. This was business. Monday came. I walked into the boardroom just before 9 a.m. Diana. Our general counsel was already seated, flipping through a folder but avoiding my eyes. Samuel was there, seated beside Dad with a thick binder laid out in front of him. Dad opened the meeting. "We're here," he began to address serious concerns regarding the company's recent management direction. He gestured toward Samuel. "Mr. Foster has compiled a report we need to review in full." For nearly an hour, Samuel walked the board through his version of my leadership. Every acquisition reframed as impulsive. Every expansion described as wasteful. The European office was premature, the R&D investments reckless. Then came the insinuations, vendor favoritism, personal gain, no specifics, just enough suggestion to stir doubt. When he finished, Dad folded his hands and looked around the table. "Before we vote," he said, "Maxwell has the floor." I kept my voice steady. "Our valuation didn't climb because of luck," I said. "Every strategic move I made, every expansion, every vendor partnership was reviewed by this board, approved by this board." I walked them through the numbers. Revenue increases, market share growth, employee retention. I didn't dodge the risks. I explained them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't appeal for sympathy. I laid out the facts, start to finish. When I reached the part about vendor relationships, I paused. I've acted in the company's best interest at every turn, I said. And if there are concerns about transparency, I welcome an independent review. Noah nodded. 2 others leaned forward, glancing at each other. But the rest? Their eyes were on Dad. He stood. I moved that we remove Maxwell Carter from his position as Chief Operating Officer effective immediately. The vote was called. 7 in favor, 4 against. It was done. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I gathered my notes and stood. "You don't do anything except collect a paycheck," Dad said loud enough for the room to hear. "You can go. The company will be better off with real leadership." Security was already in the hallway. They gave me 30 minutes to clear my office. As I packed, Grace slipped in and shut the door behind her. She handed me a small flash drive. "Everything you might need," she said. "They think you were building a kingdom. They didn't realize you were building a firewall." I nodded, thanked her quietly, and kept packing. Outside, the sky had turned overcast. I stood beneath the main entrance overhang and called Amanda. "It's done," I said. "What now?" she asked. I looked up at the building, the place I'd given everything to. "Now," I said, "we wait." That night, my mother called. She'd heard from one of the bored wives. Her voice cracked when she said she didn't know what Dad had planned. Jessica, who'd kept her distance from the company for years, showed up at the house and confronted him. It didn't go well. By morning, rumors had already reached the market. Our stock dropped 5% before noon. I didn't give interviews. I didn't release statements. I didn't fight in public. I just waited. And the silence said more than any speech ever could. For 2 full weeks, after I was forced out of Carter Industrial, I didn't return calls. I didn't answer emails. I didn't check in with old clients or even post a single update on my business profile. I stayed home. Spent mornings at the kitchen table with Amanda watching Lily smear yogurt on her high chair tray. Took walks around the block without thinking about operations reports. Listened to silence. But I didn't stop watching. Through quiet conversations and a few trusted contacts, I tracked what was happening inside the company. Dad and Samuel wasted no time. They began undoing everything we had built, slowing down the automation rollout, cutting back R&D spending, shelving the expansion into Asia that had already been halfway negotiated. On paper, it looked like a return to tradition. Inside it looked like a slow leak. Production schedules slipped. 2 small clients dropped their contracts. A few employees I'd mentored started looking for work elsewhere. Then 15 days after I'd been shown the door, I met Martin Bennett for lunch. He slid the final contract across the table. "You sure this is when you want to do it?" he asked, watching me sign. "Your father won't take it well." "He made his decision," I said. "Now I'm making mine." By the time the ink dried, I was the sole owner of Bennett Materials, the supplier responsible for more than half of Carter Industrial's key components. The next morning, my legal team sent over a formal letter. It was professionally worded, polite, and purposefully vague. Just a simple announcement that Bennett Materials had changed ownership and a meeting would be helpful to discuss next steps in the vendor relationship. Dad never read it. He passed it along to someone in purchasing with a quick note to handle it. 3 days later, a shipment was delayed. Not canceled, just slowed down by a new round of quality checks. Minor enough to avoid panic, but enough to throw off the floor schedule. A week after that, another delay. This time it halted one of their highest volume lines. The purchasing manager called Bennett to escalate. He was told the new owner was reviewing all client contracts, including Carter Industrials. That's when Dad got involved. He picked up the phone and called the main office directly. "I want to speak to the new owner," he said loud enough to be heard across the office floor. I had left instructions with the receptionist. "Our representative will be there at 10 tomorrow morning," she said. At 9:59 the next day, I walked through the front doors of Carter Industrial for the first time since being removed. The same two security guards who had escorted me out now held the door open. Neither made eye contact. A young assistant brought me to the executive conference room. Inside, Dad sat at the head of the table. Samuel stood by the whiteboard, arms crossed. 3 department heads filled the rest of the seats, flipping through files, trying to look busy. Dad looked up and froze. "What is this?" he asked, pushing back from the table. I laid my business cards in front of each of them. "I'm here on behalf of Bennett Materials," I said, "as the new owner." Samuel leaned forward. "You're not serious." "I'm entirely serious." Dad's voice cracked. "You planned this." "I made a strategic investment," I said, "just like you made the choice to remove me." For the next hour, I went through the new terms. Pricing would increase by 15%. Delivery schedules would be adjusted. Payment terms would shorten to 30 days. Samuel pushed back immediately. "This is outrageous. We'll just find another vendor." "You're welcome to," I said. "But it'll take 6 to 8 months to test and certify new alloys. That's assuming you can find a supplier who meets the same specs. In the meantime, you'll be out of inventory by the end of the quarter." I slid the new agreement across the table. "These terms go into effect immediately. If you choose not to renew, Bennett has other interested clients." Dad didn't speak. He stared at the contract, then at me, then back again. "You'll kill this company just to get even." "I'm running my business," I said, standing. "You're the one who removed your best chance of keeping this one afloat." 3 days later, the board met again. Noah led the discussion this time. Several members who had supported my removal now questioned whether it had been the right move. Samuel tried to argue that the supply chain could be repaired, but the legal team confirmed that the Bennett acquisition had followed every rule. When the vote came, the board accepted the new terms. There was no other viable choice. No one looked at Dad. He sat at the end of the table silent, his hands folded in front of him. Later that afternoon, I ran into Noah in the parking lot. "That was bold," he said. "It was necessary." He nodded slowly. "He underestimated you, completely." I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to prove. Power had shifted. Dad still had his title. But now the company's future rested on a supply chain he no longer controlled. And that was only the beginning. The new contract between Bennett Materials and Carter Industrial went into effect the following Monday. Within 2 weeks, the numbers started shifting. The higher material costs cut directly into their margins. A few long-standing clients raised concerns. Another quietly pulled out of a renewal. The press started to notice. One industry site ran a short article about leadership volatility at Carter Industrial. The headline didn't name names, but the photo showed Dad standing alone at a podium, sleeves rolled up, eyes down. I kept to my schedule. Bennett Materials was growing. I'd already begun negotiations with 2 smaller suppliers, one in Ohio, another in Arizona. Both had strong teams and aging leadership. Within a month, I had them under contract. We didn't change names, but we folded their expertise and resources into our process. I stayed out of Carter's way. Our deliveries were always on time. Every quality standard was met. Terms were enforced but never changed without notice. Nothing was aggressive, just consistent. That spring, my mother called and asked if we could meet for lunch. We met at the small cafe near the old library, the same one she used to take Rachel and me to when we were kids. She stirred her tea slowly, avoiding my eyes for a long time. "Your father doesn't say it," she finally said, "but I know what's happening. He's not sleeping. His blood pressure's up. The doctors want him on medication." She folded her napkin neatly. "He still believes he can fix it." I nodded, letting her finish. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything she said. I just don't want this to kill him." A week later, I got a call from Rachel. She'd stepped in as a consultant short-term, just to help stabilize operations. It's worse than I thought, she said. The board is spooked. They're looking at offloading assets. 3 department heads have submitted their resignations, and Dad won't even talk about restructuring. What about Bennett, I asked. He still thinks he can replace you, but he's running out of time. That weekend, I brought Noah and Amanda to the house. We sat around the dining room table while Lily napped upstairs. I laid out what I had in mind. A full reintegration of Bennett into Carter, debt restructuring, a phased return to the modernization plan. I even drafted a path for Dad to step back gracefully, no press scandal, no lawsuits. We worked on it for 2 weeks, quietly, carefully. Then Carter Industrial posted a second straight quarterly loss. The banks didn't like that. Several loan covenants had been triggered. If they weren't corrected within 60 days, the lines of credit would collapse. Payroll would be in danger. Vendors would walk. That night around 11 euros, my doorbell rang. Amanda was already asleep. I came down, turned on the porch light. It was Dad. He looked tired, older than I remembered. He wasn't wearing a coat and his shirt was wrinkled at the collar. "Can I come in?" he asked. We sat in my home office. I didn't offer him anything to drink. He didn't ask. "The banks are calling in the loans," he said. "We'll be insolvent within the month unless we refinance." I watched him quietly. His hands were clasped fingers white at the knuckles. "Is that what you wanted?" he asked, eyes still on the floor. "To bring it all down?" "No," I said. "I wanted to build it. You're the one who couldn't let it change." He nodded slowly, then looked up. "The board's meeting tomorrow. They're pushing for bankruptcy options. Unless you have a different plan," I said. He didn't respond. I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out the folder. "I've had this ready," I said, sliding it across. "Full refinancing proposal. Bennett folds into Carter as a division. We restructure leadership and bring in independent oversight." He opened the folder, flipped through a few pages. "And what do you want?" he asked. "CEO." He leaned back in the chair. "And me, you become chairman. Focus on client relationships. You still have the name. People still pick up when you call." He didn't answer. He just nodded, once closed the folder, and left. The next morning, the board approved the proposal. Unanimously. Noah called me after the vote. "Was that the plan all along?" he asked. "It was always an option," I said. The press release went out that afternoon. Strategic reorganization, new leadership structure, vertical integration. No one mentioned the boardroom ambush from 6 months before. I didn't ask for it to be mentioned. When I walked back into Carter Industrial the next morning, the lobby staff greeted me by name. Grace met me at the elevator. "Welcome back," she said. "We've been waiting." Dad had already moved his office downstairs. Client relations. He didn't come up to the executive floor that day, and I didn't expect him to. The first few weeks back at Carter Industrial felt both familiar and foreign. Grace had held on to as much of the modernization framework as she could while I'd been gone. I stepped back into the systems one meeting at a time, steady and deliberate. Some employees greeted me like I'd never left. Others kept their distance, unsure how to read the shift in power. Dad kept to his new office downstairs. We didn't speak much except when we needed to. Once he passed me in the hallway and handed over a folder without saying a word. It was the Peterson account, one of our bigger clients who'd been threatening to cut their order in half. I promised I'd follow up. That was how it went for a while. Business first. No eye contact unless necessary. Samuel resigned a few weeks after the transition. He packed his things quietly, left without a speech. There wasn't much for him to do once the board made it clear the new structure was permanent. The integration of Bennett Materials moved fast. Our margins started climbing again. With tighter logistics and cleaner inventory flows, we shaved nearly 12% off production costs in the first quarter. Clients noticed. So did the banks. By the end of spring, we were profitable again. We weren't back to a $500 million valuation yet, but the momentum was real. I started hearing from partners who had gone quiet during the previous year. A few vendors reached out about expanding supply contracts. One even offered to back a new product launch. Dad saw the numbers, but he didn't say much. Most days he showed up, took a few client calls, answered emails, and left before 5. It wasn't until midsummer that something shifted. He missed a meeting with a key distributor. Grace covered it without issue, but later that week I got a message from my mother asking if we could talk. We met at the house. She made iced tea like she always had lemon wedges in an old glass pitcher, coasters under every glass, even though the table was worn down. "He's not feeling right," she said. "They caught something during his checkup. It's not urgent, but it's there." I didn't ask what it was. I just listened. That weekend, she organized a family dinner, first one in over a year. Rachel came with her boyfriend. Amanda brought Lily, who ran circles around the coffee table with a plastic toy drum. Dad sat quiet through most of the meal, ate slowly, barely touched his drink. After dessert, he asked me to come out back. It was the same porch where he'd once told me the business would be mine someday, the same spot where years later he told me to earn it like everybody else. We stood there for a long time without speaking. Crickets filled the gaps. The back porch light flickered a little the way it always had in summer. He cleared his throat. "I've been watching what you've done," he said. "The refinancing, the integration. I didn't think it would work." I nodded, but didn't say anything. "You use the same principles I taught you," he added, looking toward the garden beds along the fence. "But you saw something I didn't." I held on too tight. He turned, then eyes meeting mine for the first time that night. "I was wrong. About you. About the company. About how I handled everything." The air felt still, like even the breeze was waiting. "I didn't see it at the time," he said. "But I see it now. The words didn't come all at once, and they weren't polished. But they were real. I don't expect anything," he said. "I just needed to say it." We stood there a while longer. The porch light flickered again. Lily's laughter carried from inside the house. "We can move forward," I said. "There's still work to do, but we can do it differently this time." He nodded slower this time. "Yeah, we can." That fall, things began to feel more balanced. Dad took fewer calls, spent more time meeting clients in smaller groups where his old-school charm still mattered. He didn't interfere with operations, didn't question decisions. The company found its rhythm again. New talent joined the team. Old clients returned. Carter Industrial started to feel less like a battleground and more like what it was always meant to be. By the start of the new fiscal year, Carter Industrial had found its footing again. We weren't just back, we were climbing. The Bennett integration had stabilized material costs. Our operations team had tightened workflows across all plants. Client retention was holding strong, and new contracts were coming in steadily. Grace led a full audit of our mid-tier supplier agreements and shaved another 4% off annual spend. By summer, our valuation had cleared $600 million. By fall, we passed $750. The anniversary celebration was already in motion, 40 years since the company opened its doors in a rented warehouse on the edge of town. Planning had begun months earlier, but now the tone had changed. The board wanted something big, a true milestone event. It was scheduled for the second Saturday in October. Industry partners, legacy employees, regional media, everyone was invited. We booked the main ballroom at the Lakeside Convention Center, brought in a catering team from Chicago, and had commemorative displays built showing every major decade of growth. Dad hadn't said much about the event. He came to planning meetings, offered a few nods of approval, but mostly kept quiet. Still, we all knew his presence would matter that night. When the lights dimmed and the opening montage played across the screens, people leaned in. The room had gone quiet. Images of our earliest product lines flashed beside new ones, old blueprints beside new patents. Photos of Dad standing with rolled sleeves and a hard hat in the 80s filled the room with something you could feel. Then the MC called him to the stage. He walked slowly but steady. His suit was dark gray, well-cut, the same tie he'd worn at my college graduation. The room gave him a full standing ovation before he even reached the mic. He smiled, waited, then began. 40 years ago, he said, I signed a lease on a building I couldn't afford for equipment. I didn't know how to run in an industry I barely understood. All I had was a willingness to work, and a belief that if I gave it everything, I had something good would come of it. The crowd stayed quiet. He glanced down at his notes, then folded them and set them aside. I've made my share of mistakes, he said, some of them costly, some of them personal. You could hear the air shift in the room. But the smartest thing I ever did, he said, was surround myself with people who were smarter than me, braver than me, and more willing to challenge what was comfortable. He looked out at the crowd, but his eyes landed on me. The greatest asset Carter Industrial ever acquired wasn't a product or a contract, he said. It was my son. There wasn't a sound. I didn't always see it clearly, and there were years I couldn't admit it at all. But the truth is, this company wouldn't be where it is without his vision, his leadership, and his belief in what we could become even when I couldn't see it myself. He turned to the side of the stage and motioned for me to join him. I stood slowly. As I walked up, I could feel hundreds of eyes following every step. He extended his hand, then without hesitation pulled me into a hug. He leaned in and whispered, "You earned this, all of it." I stepped up to the microphone, heart, steady words measured. "We're proud of where we've been," I said, "but even more proud of where we're going." The applause rose again. After the speeches, people came up one by one. Old partners, former employees, young engineers who had just joined the company 6 months earlier. They shook my hand, shared their stories, pointed to displays showing where their departments had contributed. Amanda stood near the back with Lily, who wore a velvet dress and held one of the company's original lapel pins like it was a treasure. My mother wiped her eyes with a napkin. Rachel stood beside her with her arm around her shoulders. Later that night, I stepped outside for air. The patio overlooked the water lights reflecting across the still surface. Dad joined me, a cup of coffee in his hand. "You're the right one to carry it forward," he said quietly. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. Inside, the celebration continued. But on that patio, for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. A few weeks after the anniversary gala, Dad officially announced his retirement. There was no press conference, no long speech, just a quiet board memo, a handshake in the conference room, and a simple statement, "It's time." He kept a small office near the client lounge, more of a formality than anything else. Some days he'd stop in around noon, sip coffee with old suppliers, or take a phone call from someone he'd known for decades. But mostly he stayed out of the way. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like we weren't working against each other. We were standing on the same foundation, just at different ends of it. Carter Industrial kept growing. We opened a second operations center in Colorado, launched a new energy-efficient product line, and brought on 2 directors under 40, bright, thoughtful, full of ideas. Grace stayed on as VP of Operations. Rachel signed a 2-year contract as a consulting lead. Amanda, who had seen every part of this journey, joined our leadership retreat that spring and gave a talk about strategic vision that had even our most seasoned engineers taking notes. One afternoon, I passed Dad in the hallway. He had just come from lunch with one of our earliest clients, someone he'd helped get financing back in the 90s. "They still think I know what I'm doing," he said with a half smile. "You do," I told him. "You just don't have to carry it alone anymore." He nodded, then looked out through the lobby glass. The sun caught the company logo on the far wall, the same logo we'd updated 2 years ago, but still carried his original initials in the bottom corner. "It looks different now," he said, "but it's still ours." That night I stood by Lily's door as she fell asleep, one hand wrapped around her stuffed bear, the nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall. Amanda walked up beside me and leaned her head on my shoulder. "You ever think it would end like this?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. No, but maybe it didn't end. Maybe this is what it looks like when something finally begins. Looking back, I don't think the story was ever about taking something from my father. It was about building something bigger than both of us. About letting go of pride long enough to see what could grow when trust takes root. In the end, legacy isn't about preserving what was. It's about creating space for what could be strong enough to last, flexible enough to change, and honest enough to admit when it needs to. If you've ever been torn between honoring what came before you and building something new, just know that the two aren't enemies. They're partners, but only if you let them be. Thank you for being here with me and for listening to this story all the way through. If it brought something up for you, something you've been holding or working through, feel free to share it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. There's always more to tell.